The broadcast had been designed to break humanity's spirit. Instead, it broke something else entirely. Fleet Marshal Renata Oyalaran Cross stood in the command bunker beneath New Geneva and watched, along with 11 billion other human beings scattered across 3 worlds, as the Korrathi Dominion executed the final phase of their message. 10 million colonists on Halcyon Reach, men, women, children who had spent 4 generations turning a hostile moon into a garden, were herded into open courtyards under a live orbital feed, and killed within the span of 6 minutes. Their deaths broadcast on every frequency humanity used, timed precisely so that no one on Earth could look away before it was already finished. The Korrathi High Command had a name for this strategy. They called it the quieting. A tactic perfected over 3,000 years of conquest, designed to shatter the will of any species foolish enough to resist Dominion expansion. It had worked 41 times before. 41 species had watched their people die on camera and, within days, surrendered everything they had rather than risk a second quieting. Renata watched the feed until the last name scrolled off the casualty list, and when it finally ended, she did not weep. She did not rage. She simply turned to her chief strategist, a quiet, precise man named Colonel Andres Whitfield Nakamura, and said 4 words that would be repeated in history texts for the next 1,000 years. Bring me the fleet. What followed over the next 11 days would be remembered by the surviving Korrathi as the moment their 3,000-year empire learned, in the cruelest way possible, exactly what kind of species it had chosen to quiet. But none of this had begun that way. 6 months earlier, the Korrathi Dominion hadn't even considered humanity worth the effort of a formal invasion. Humanity's first contact with the Dominion had been almost accidental. A survey ship, stumbling into contested border space, met not with negotiation, but with an ultimatum delivered by Dominion High Marshal Vekthar Asaloon: submit to tributary status within 1 solar cycle, or be classified as a hostile power subject to pacification. Vekthar had issued the same ultimatum to dozens of species before humanity, and every single one had eventually knelt. He saw no reason humanity would be any different. They have colonized 3 worlds in less than a century. His intelligence officer, a sharp and increasingly uneasy woman named Threya von Drissel, told him during the initial briefing, their weapons technology is unremarkable by Dominion standards. But Marshal, their population growth, their industrial capacity, their numbers mean nothing without discipline. Vekthar interrupted. I have conquered species with populations 10 times theirs. What matters is whether they break. Earth's response to the ultimatum had been immediate and, to Vekthar's mind, almost insultingly simple. A formal rejection, delivered not by a general or a fleet commander, but by a civilian diplomat who made no threats at all. We will not submit to a demand made without cause, the message read. If you believe force is the only language we understand, you are welcome to test that belief. We would prefer you didn't. Vekthar had laughed at the message in front of his entire command staff. 3 weeks later, he ordered the quitting of Halcyon Reach, specifically because it was the smallest, most vulnerable human colony in Dominion Reach, a demonstration calibrated to terrify a young species into instant surrender, with minimal Dominion risk. He had not expected the demonstration to fail so completely, or so fast. The Council had made a terrible mistake in assuming humanity's restraint during the ultimatum period was fear. It was patience. In the 6 months since first contact, Earth's military command had not been negotiating in good faith while secretly hoping for peace. They had been quietly preparing for a war they suspected, correctly, was already unavoidable. Every human shipyard from Luna to the outer asteroid belt had spent those 6 months building toward a single strategic doctrine that Colonel Andres Whitfield Nakamura had spent a decade developing and refining. Total, decisive, and utterly merciless response to any attack on human civilians. It was not a doctrine born of cruelty. It was born of history, of a species that remembered, in its bones, exactly what happened to nations that answered atrocity with half measures. If they test us, Andres had told the Joint Chiefs during a classified briefing months before Halcyon Reach fell, we cannot afford to respond proportionally. Proportional responses only work against enemies who fear losing something. The Dominion has conquered 41 species. They don't fear losing worlds. They fear losing the myth of their own invincibility. That's the only thing we can actually take from them. Nobody in that briefing room fully believed they would ever need the plan. That belief died the moment the Halcyon Reach broadcast began. In the 18 hours between the massacre and the fleet's departure, Renata Ayalaran Cross made a decision that Andres Whitfield Nakamura would remember for the rest of his life. She ordered every name from the Halcyon Reach casualty list read aloud, once, in full, over every military channel humanity controlled, not as propaganda, not to inflame the crews preparing for war, but as a promise she intended every officer under her command to carry with them into battle. "I want them to remember these are people," she told Andres privately, as the names scrolled past on the bunker's main display. "Not statistics, not justification. People. The moment we let this become about vengeance instead of preventing the next Halcyon Reach, we become no better than the thing we're about to fight." Andres studied her for a long moment. "Some of the fleet won't see the difference, Marshal. Grief doesn't usually care about nuance. Then it's our job to hold the line they can't," Renata said. "Every one of us. All the way to Korrathi Prime, if that's where this ends." The human fleet that departed Earth 18 hours after the massacre bore no resemblance to the disorganized, undisciplined force Dominion intelligence had predicted. 300 warships, built in secret over 6 months of frantic, silent industry, moved in coordinated formation toward Dominion space, not toward the nearest border world, not toward an easy symbolic target, but directly toward Korrathi Prime itself, the Dominion's ancient capital, a world that had not seen enemy warships in its skies in over 1,000 years. Vekthar Ossaloon received the news of the fleet's approach with open contempt. 300 ships against the heart of the Dominion? They've made this simple for us. Everything changed in the next few seconds of that briefing when his tactical officer reported the fleet's weapon signatures. And Vekthar realized, for the first time, that humanity had not built 300 warships to fight a conventional battle. They had built 300 delivery platforms for a single, terrible purpose. 3 of Vandrasal understood before anyone else in the command staff. "Marshal, those aren't standard kinetic weapons. Those energy signatures match nothing in our threat database. If my analysis is correct, say it. They're not coming to conquer Korrathi Prime," she said quietly. "They're coming to make sure we can never do this to anyone again." The truth stunned the entire Dominion command structure over the following 72 hours, as reports flooded in from 3 border fleets that had attempted to intercept the human advance and simply ceased transmitting mid-engagement. Human weapons technology, dismissed for months as unremarkable, had in fact been developed along a doctrine no Dominion strategist had ever encountered. Not designed to outgun Dominion ships in a prolonged campaign, but engineered specifically to end engagements in minutes, trading elegance and sustainability for absolute, immediate lethality. It was a doctrine built by a species that had already decided this would be the only war it fought against the Dominion, and had chosen not to survive it gracefully, but to end it decisively. Nobody knew what humanity was truly capable of until the fleet reached Korrathi Prime's outer defense perimeter and dismantled it in under 40 minutes. A defensive network that had repelled 3 separate invasion attempts across Dominion history. Vekthar Ossaloon, watching his home system's defenses collapse in real time, made one final attempt to salvage what remained of Dominion pride. He opened a direct channel to the human flagship, expecting to negotiate, expecting the diplomatic caution that had characterized every human communication before Halcyon Reach. Fleet Marshal Renata Ayalaran Cross answered the channel herself. "You murdered 10 million civilians on camera to teach us to fear you," she said, her voice utterly level, without a trace of triumph. "We're here to teach you something in return. Some things cannot be unshown to a species once they've been shown it. We will not forget, we will not forgive, and we will not allow the Dominion to ever again believe that mercy is a weakness it can exploit." "You would commit genocide," Vekthar said, To prove a point about mercy, Renata's expression did not change. We're not here to erase your species out of hatred, Marshal. We're here because 41 species knelt to the quieting before us, and every single surrender only taught you that this strategy works. The only way to make sure you never do this to anyone else is to make certain the doctrine itself dies with the empire that built it. What followed was not a massacre in the way Vecthar had inflicted one. Human forces methodically dismantled the Dominion's military infrastructure, its orbital shipyards, its command network, systematically destroying the Empire's capacity to wage war ever again, while sparing civilian population centers with a precision that stunned Dominion analysts who had expected indiscriminate retaliation. It was devastating, total, and utterly without the cruelty the Dominion itself had shown at Halcyon Reach. When it was finished, 11 days after it began, the Korrathi Dominion existed only as scattered, disarmed remnants, a civilization that had lost its capacity for conquest forever, but whose people, against every expectation Vecthar had carried into that final transmission, were still alive to rebuild something new. Threa Vondrissel, one of the few senior Dominion officers to survive the campaign, would spend the rest of her life studying what she came to call humanity's unforgivable mercy. A species that had every justification, every capability, and every emotional right to erase the Korrathi entirely, and had chosen instead to erase only the Empire's ability to hurt anyone ever again. They didn't kill us because they hated us, she wrote, in the definitive Dominion history of the war that ended their empire. They stopped us because they refused to let hatred be the last word. That is a harder kind of strength than anything we ever built, and it is the reason, centuries later, that any of us are still here to remember it at all. Fleet Marshal Renata Oyalaran Cross returned to Earth 11 days after the campaign began, and the first thing she did, before any formal debrief, before any celebration her exhausted crews desperately wanted to give her, was travel alone to the memorial wall being built in New Geneva for the 10 million dead of Halcyon Reach. She stood there for a long time, reading names that had already been carved into permanent stone, names she had memorized during the 18 hours before the fleet departed, and had never once allowed herself to forget. Andres found her there, as he had found her in the bunker on the worst night of her career. He didn't ask how she felt, he already knew. We could have erased them entirely, he said quietly. Command wanted it, half the fleet wanted it. I know, Renata said, that's exactly why we couldn't. Colonel Andres Whitfield Nakamura went on to help draft the doctrine that would govern human military conduct for the next generation. A doctrine built not on the assumption that humanity would never be tested again, but on the certainty that it eventually would be, and the conviction that how a species chose to win mattered just as much as whether it won at all. Decades later, when a new generation of officers studied the Halcyon Reach campaign in military academies across a dozen allied worlds, the lesson their instructors emphasized was never the devastating efficiency of the human fleet, or the collapse of an empire that had stood unchallenged for 3,000 years. It was the 18 hours before the fleet ever left Earth. The quiet, deliberate choice to remember the dead as people first, and enemies second, and to let that single distinction decide the shape of everything that followed. Threa Vondrissel outlived Vecthar Ossaloon by nearly 40 years, long enough to watch the shattered remnants of the Dominion slowly rebuild themselves into something unrecognizable from the empire that had ordered the quieting of Halcyon Reach. Smaller, humbler, and, for the first time in 3,000 years, entirely without the capacity to threaten anyone beyond its own borders, she never met Renata Oyalaran Cross in person. But in the final chapter of her history, she addressed her directly anyway, in words she knew the fleet marshal would likely never read. You could have made us disappear, she wrote. Instead, you made sure we would spend the rest of our history remembering exactly why we deserve to survive only on your terms, and never again on our own cruelty. I do not know if that is mercy or judgment. I have come to believe, after 40 years of reflection, that it was both, and that the difference between them mattered less than the fact that you chose it at all.